All right, we are back. I want to thank Kate Nagel, our news editor, for coming on, giving an update first thing. And I think we covered everything from last week's shooting to the big news out of GE and an update on CVS and Aetna. Chris joins me, legal counsel over at United Nurses, at the forefront of some of the biggest issues going on in Rhode Island. And Rhode Island, like many states, healthcare is a huge component to the state's economy. About 70,000 people in Rhode Island are somehow tied to the healthcare industry. Let's talk about Memorial Hospital. Last week or so, Care New England filed with the Department of Health an application to close the facility. Implications for 800 employees, 600 plus full-time employees. You guys came out with some pretty strong statement today about them sort of jumping over the process and making some unilateral actions.
Right, so it was almost like under the cover of darkness. Late last week, they sent a letter to all the medical staff and to the RNs, although the RNs will tell you they didn't get the letter, basically saying if patients have any number of broad range of conditions, that they should not be admitted to the hospital, number one. And number two, that they've taken on the liberty of going out to the EMS folks and saying, don't be taking any patients to the emergency department at the hospital. Now, last time I checked the law in this state, you don't close a hospital until the Department of Health says it's okay for you to close a hospital. And in effect, what we believe is happening here is Care New England is closing the hospital before I think their application to close it has even been deemed complete. We think they're out over their skis, they're way ahead, and the idea of the reverse CON process, as far as we understand it, is that when you have a closure of a hospital, which is a big deal, or a service, which is a big deal, you've got to try to maintain some kind of stability in the community. In this instance, Pawtucket, the surrounding areas, the Blackstone Valley. You don't do it by doing what Care New England has done, which is they announce a closure. They say that there will be some services on that campus, primary specialty. They can't give anybody any detail in that regard. They can't tell anybody how many jobs will stay there. But we find out that they are well prepared to say, don't bring any patients through the ED, and if you have any of these conditions, folks, you're not going to be admitted. Doesn't make any sense to us.
Chris, tell me, this is it's a very frustrating storyline for us to cover. Because the shells seem to be moving at all the time. So it's only about 10 days since the original submission of application for the closure went in. Very little information given. It was only a partial application. It wasn't compiled. There seems to be confusion in the mayor's office about that process. He has yet to even file a letter opposing the closure. And, where is this being driven from? Is it being driven from Care New England's headquarters, which is, who's in charge there is always difficult to determine. Most executives there have been changed out once or twice in the last 24 months. Yeah. Is this being driven in part by partners up in Boston who are trying to acquire Care New England? Do you get a sense of who's calling the shots on this thing?
I don't know who's calling the shots, so I wouldn't dare to offer an opinion about that. But all I can say is that we are as frustrated as everybody is, and every stakeholder is, and reporters are, and the mayor is, and maybe the governor is. Who knows where she is on this? I mean, she's advocating to be able to find jobs for these folks. But the problem that's been created here is really Care New England's doing. They have a bad habit of making major decisions without thinking them through thoroughly, without talking to all the stakeholders, and without having plans. Right? Think about that. You announce that you're closing a hospital that's been in that community for 100 years, and you can't tell people when you say that some services will be preserved and therefore some jobs, you can't tell them what that means. I think if you called Mayor Grebian, he'd probably tell you he's frustrated too. He can't get a straight answer from them.
So Mike Fine's been on a couple times, former director of health, and a huge thinker about healthcare. You are an extremely popular man.
It's kind of rude, isn't it? Sorry about that.
No, don't worry about it. I always like on Morning Joe when somebody's phone goes off. Kate Nagel had an infamous case on Lively Experiment one time. I think we still show that tape on a regular basis here. But regardless, One of the things that I think has been that Mike Fine has talked about is one, hey, listen, maybe there's too many beds, but in a case of a Woonsocket and a Pawtucket, he makes this point, listen, these hospitals are critically important to those communities' economy. I mean, 800 people, listen, we're spending all this time fighting about a Pawtucket Red Sox stadium, which might have 30 full-time jobs on its best day. And here's a case of a hospital that has 800 employees, 600 full-time, and nobody seemed to be giving it the exact same level of attention and how important that those 600 jobs are to that community.
Well, that's true that it hasn't been getting as much attention as it deserves. And, we have had problems with Care New England from the get-go when this transaction took place. I think it was 3.5 years ago when Memorial became part of the Care New England system. And the problems we had immediately were that there didn't seem to be a well-thought-out plan to reach into that community and try to reverse what I would call the out-migration of people who used to use that hospital and went elsewhere. There were physicians who were leaving under Frank Dietz slowly but surely, and there was an erosion of that patient base. And our view was that Care New England had to do more than just simply say, hey, look, we've now brought that into our system, and now magically people are going to show up. Right? You need to get into that community and actually do something remarkable, and that is to look at somebody and talk to somebody and say, you should come to Memorial Hospital for your care, and here's why.
Right.
We have terrific nurses and docs and people in the lab and pharmacists and social workers and PT and OT and all these folks, all these services, and it never happened. And then you wonder why there was an anemic patient volume, and then now that failure actually is now being used by Care New England to say, hey, look, we tried, we put a lot of money into the place, but the volume's not there, we're losing money, we got to close it.
Is one of the problems historically that just got glossed over by maybe the economy or healthcare ability to increase costs, is that the Care New England structure was a bunch of pieces that didn't really fit together with any symmetry. You had a facility that was primarily for women in the birth of children. You had mental health. You had a hospital in Warwick, and then add on Pawtucket, and there really it never seemed to be that great strategic thought about how this whole system could work together.
Well, let me take it a step further. Dr. Fine's probably spoken about this on your program. There has been a complete absence of an overall health care plan for the state of Rhode Island for years. And the first wake-up call that we needed something like that, a comprehensive plan, is when Landmark went into receivership in June of 2008. And now you and I are sitting here talking, not quite, but almost a decade later. We've had Westerly go through a receivership, right?
Yep.
We have the woes of this closure up in Pawtucket at Memorial, and there have been various groups that have been put together at the State House and out of the governor's office, trying to come up with some comprehensive plan, but while the bureaucracy has been doing whatever they're doing in that regard, there's been no comprehensive planning whatsoever in healthcare. And so, now we're in a situation where we have hospitals that are bankrupt, hospitals that are closing, jobs on the line, services discontinued in cities and towns across the state where the hospitals are, the second biggest, maybe the largest, maybe Wesley Hospital is the largest employer down there. And to this day, as we're speaking now, that's still the case. There isn't a comprehensive plan.
Memorial Hospital has to be the second largest private employer, only to Hasbro in Pawtucket, and it may actually be larger in total number of employees located in that city. I think there's around 600 at the campus on Newport Avenue of Hasbro, and Pawtucket's facing that Hasbro may consolidate their different locations into Providence. And then, of course, news broke late last week, still rolling across Wall Street today, that Hasbro may acquire Mattel. So, nothing is a constant anymore. Let's jump over to another issue that we've had a lot of interaction on and that you guys have been very aggressive on, and we've covered a lot, which is the collapse of the pension system at St. Joseph's Health Services, another victim of consolidation of hospitals. And in that case, 4 years ago, roughly 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, Charter Care, which was the conglomerate of St. Joe's and as well as Fatima and Roger Williams, was acquired by a California company, Prospect, And in that transaction, the Department of Health and the Attorney General allowed the pension system of those who had worked at St. Joe's to be, quote, orphaned and left to the side. And they made the representation that the was fully funded or nearly fully funded, and that it was solvent, and it was given an approval, and that process went forward. 3 years later, plus a few months, in August, that pension fund representing 2,800 folks gets deemed to be insolvent, goes into a receivership. It's the biggest pension failure in Rhode Island history. Talk a little bit about what UNAP's been doing and where we are now.
Well, when that announcement was made, we had a meeting in our office space almost immediately, and we've invited everybody. Our view of it then and now is that this is not just a battle for people who are in the union who are working at the hospital or vested in that plan. Our view is that this is a battle for every one of the participants. And we have organized quite a few informational pickets in front of the courthouse on Benefit Street at various hearings in this manner. Folks have picketed over at the Diocese of Providence. We'll be doing more of that as time goes on, because there has to be in our view a highly visible public element to a campaign. We're not of a mind to look at this and think that a legal proceeding in and of itself is going to get us to where we got to go, or to minimize the pain that's going to be visited upon people who are participants in that plan. And so, it's our hope that concerted activity publicly, whether we're directing our energies toward the diocese or Prospect or Mercer or Angel Pension or whoever it is, and a lot of that still hasn't been sorted out. It's important for us to make sure that we're out publicly reminding people of what's happened here, and to bring pressure to bear on folks who don't cooperate with Max Wistow, the special counsel, or don't cooperate with Mr. Del Sesto, the receiver, or don't do what they should be doing in this process that's overseen by Judge Stern. So we're gonna push as hard as we can, as long as we can.
One of the things we've talked about a number of times, and we've reported on it, GoLocal's was founded in 2010. We always had a very strong relationship with the Diocese of Providence. Regardless if it was good news or bad news, the diocese responded, and generally it was Bishop Tobin responded. Even when a priest was in trouble for allegations or whatever it might be, he was a little bit of a moth to flame when it came to a press inquiry. That relationship literally transformed on August 17th when, I called over, and I'd been involved with capital campaigns at Catholic schools that helped raise him millions of dollars, and cannot get a returned phone call, a returned email, or returned anything else in nearly 3 months subsequent. Are you disappointed? I mean, somebody who represents folks who had worked in a Catholic facility, is there just from our standpoint, a bit of a disconnect of what everything the Catholic diocese stands for and what's transpired in just the last 3 months?
Well, there's been more than a disconnect. I mean, they're not credible in the few responses they've made in the controlled environments in which they've made them. Right?
Primarily the Rhode Island Catholic, their newspaper.
Right, but just think about this. Think about these basics, right? During the time that that joint venture was being put together between Prospect and Charter Care, the diocese insisted that Fatima retain its Catholic identity.
Correct.
They put a high-placed person in the diocese on that pension board.
Right.
The Vatican had to give its approval of that deal.
Mm-hmm.
The diocese continued to claim, as they have dating back to the 70s or maybe 1965, that that's a church plan and not an ERISA plan, and therefore is not at all regulated by the federal government, right? So they've got their tentacles in that institution and in that plan, but as soon as that plan fails, we have nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
Right? Now,
well, even more so, just to go back a little bit earlier, that was the 2014 deal. In 2009, when St. Joe's merged into
Charter Care, right?
Charter Care, the chairman of the board for that year during the transaction was Bishop Tobin.
Right.
So hard to say, not a hand in there. And also a key part of that transition of St. Joe's and Fatima into Roger Williams and the creation of Charter Care was the restrictions on abortions
Right.
at the hospital
Right.
at Fatima.
Right.
So,
Right. So this notion now that they have nothing to do with it is not to be believed. I find that whenever there's a crisis in our country or in our state these days, the response is that our thoughts and our prayers go out to people and their families, and people may appreciate those prayers, but that's not going to cure the deficiencies in those pension payments that are facing cuts as early as February. It's not good enough. It's just not credible, their position. And now what's going to be interesting is as Max does his investigative work and fulfills his role as special counsel, we're going to see more of, I think, this two-step from the diocese, because subpoenas are issuing and there'll be
Right.
inquiries, and they're going to have to make a decision about what they're going to do. I'll tell you one other thing that I got wind of a week or so ago, and maybe you're ahead of the curve on it, I'm not, is that there's some significant capital campaign that the diocese is
There is,
kicking
yeah.
off, and in large part, they're trying to raise money for retirement benefits for priests. Remarkable that that's happening at the same time that the bishop and the diocese are running for the hills on this.
well,
collapse
I
of
think
the
it
St.
raised,
Joe's
we've
pension
written
plan.
about that there's a number of other church plans within the control of the diocese, and there's got to be concern by those members of those retirees and those who are entered into those, whether or not those plans are solvent. The layperson's plan had its benefits cut back, I believe, in 2010, according to an article in the Rhode Island Catholic. There's very little, as folks disturbingly are learning now under some of the journalism we're doing. These church plans have no responsibility to disclose anything to anyone, no federal or state regulatory agency, and not to their members. So there's no requirement that they send out a quarterly statement like you would from Schwab or anyone else. And it's somewhat horrifying. And, I think both of us have been in enough meetings and talked to enough of these retirees that regardless of how callous a lawyer you are, callous a journalist you might be, it's heartbreaking to hear these primarily, mostly women who dedicated their entire lives to the care of others under the belief of the Catholic Church, and really, never thought about jumping across the street to a better paying position at some of the other hospitals, which they could have numerous times, and that they find out now in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. I spoke to one woman who her monthly payment right now is $500 a month. That's pre the proposed 40% cut.
Right.
It's $500 a month. And so very disappointing, very scary, I think, for some of these other potentially implicated folks, and really needs an overall review by the state to jump into this thing and start asking some tougher questions about, are there other folks exposed? Because at least some of your folks are a member of your unions, and you bring some gravitas and some resources and can organize pickets and hire buses and have legal counsel.
Right.
Some of these other folks, there's no union for priests.
Right.
So a very disturbing time in healthcare. Quick question: where do you see St. Joe's going next? Do you have any sense? I know there's some discussion about classes of which group goes in which proverbially bucket,
Yeah.
and there's some concern now emerging amongst the retirees of, is this going to create a divide and conquer type of situation from a standpoint of, will the 2,800 lose their power if they're not 2,800 all in one?
Yeah, I don't think that's the case. Look, as I said from the beginning, for us, we don't distinguish between any one of those 2,700 folks. Now, look, I was clear with the folks I met with. I represent the folks that are members of the union who are currently working in their vesting.
Right.
Right. That's who I represent. But we have not for a second drawn any distinction between the following. We're all in the same boat. All these folks are being treated unfairly. They're being put in a position that nobody should be put in. A promise was made, it ought to be kept, and we stand together. And look, there are going to be situations where if there are interim adjustments, as the judge is referring to them, we'll have to talk through that. But I'm not worried about divisions. What I am a little bit worried about is about the fact that there's the largest group of folks so far do not have counsel.
Yeah.
And I know that the court and Steve Del Sesto are working on that, because you want to have folks have representation, and then what can happen is that we have regular meetings, and we talk about where we
Right.
want this case to go. So I hope that middle group finds counsel soon, because I'm in regular contact with Arlene and Bob Senville, and we've already been working through a number of issues I can't get into now, but.
And Arlene's got the oldest group, mostly those in their 80s, 90s, even pushing 100 years of
Right,
age.
right.
There's
But-
about 150 or so.
Well, we haven't nailed down that number, but let's say for discussion's sake, between her group and the union group, you've got maybe 600 or 700. You've still got a couple of thousand people
Yeah,
there.
absolutely.
And
Right.
so let's get them counsel, and then everybody's represented, and then we can do some planning for whatever comes in February.
This is not your first rodeo, either of these issues. You've been involved in healthcare in Rhode Island for how long?
Not quite, but close to 20 years.
Close to 20 years. This is the toughest you've seen it?
It's been a tough go for the last 10 years. I represented the union in the receivership at Landmark. Similarly, I represented the union in the receivership at Westerly. Now I'm representing the union in this. We've been involved in all of the joint ventures and mergers and acquisitions and all that, and it's really difficult to stay on top of it. And what's a shame is that because we haven't had a comprehensive health care plan in this state, the market has dictated what happens in healthcare. And you know what? Markets are not perfect. In fact, the opposite is true. And now you're not dealing with a retail box store. You're dealing with hospitals and healthcare, and it's a different kettle of fish.
And you've got a Washington factor
boy.
of huge complexity. We had a story last week about one family whose Blue Cross costs have gone up, I don't know, 50%, 60% in the last couple of years. It's a brutal adjustment for people to try and. Plus, I think you need a PhD in something. I'm not even sure what the discipline is to try and figure out what is the best healthcare plan for anyone in the state of Rhode Island. Not getting easier and only more complex, but also a big part of Rhode Island's economy when you've got a significant portion of, nearly about 15% of the state's employees are tied to the healthcare industry. So thank you very much for coming in, as always.
Glad to come in.
We're going to take a 1-minute break, and we'll be right back. Thank Chris for coming in from Business Monday at the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center.